The Tower of London sleeps, but not quietly. Stone breathes cold. Water laps against ancient walls. Somewhere, a guard's footsteps echo across cobblestones. In separate chambers, separated by 6 years and a lifetime of lies, 2 women lie awake. Anne Boleyn, May 18th, 1536. Tomorrow, a French swordsman will separate her head from her body with a single, practiced stroke. Catherine Howard, February 12th, 1542. Tomorrow, an English axe will do the same work, though likely less cleanly. Both women know they will die. Both have been told their crimes: adultery, treason, conspiring against the king. Both have protested their innocence until their throats were raw. And both, if they're honest with themselves in these final, terrible hours, know the truth. This was never about adultery. This was about power, politics. The brutal machinery of Tudor England, grinding up women who had outlived their usefulness. Let's tell you what really happened. The story beneath the story, the machinery hidden behind the scaffold. This is why they died. Anne, 1527. You're staring again. Anne Boleyn didn't turn from the window overlooking the palace gardens. Behind her, her sister Mary, freshly discarded from the royal bed, sat embroidering with studied concentration. He's tedious, Anne said. All that poetry, all those gifts. Does he think I'm as easily won as you were? Mary's needle paused. When she spoke, her voice was careful. Be cautious, sister. The king is not a man who enjoys being refused. Then perhaps he should have married for love the first time, instead of political alliance with Spain. Anne finally turned. Mary had gained weight since her affair with Henry ended, her face soft where it had once been sharp. 2 children and royal abandonment did that to a woman. You're playing a dangerous game, Mary warned. Anne smiled. It was the smile that would later be called bewitching, enchanting, spell-casting. In truth, it was simply the smile of a woman who understood leverage. I'm not playing, I'm negotiating. Catherine, 1540. Stand still, kitten. Catherine Howard, 15 years old, terrified, dressed in borrowed finery that drowned her small frame, tried not to tremble as her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, circled her like a merchant appraising livestock. She'll do, he said finally, not to her, but to the others in the room. The family, the Howards. The ambitious Catholic nobles who saw in this frightened girl a chance to regain what Anne Boleyn had lost them 6 years ago. Does she understand what's required? Asked her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess who had raised Catherine with spectacular neglect. She understands enough. The king wants youth, compliance, someone who makes him feel powerful again. Norfolk's lips curved. Someone who makes him feel like a man. Catherine felt her cheeks flame. She knew what they meant. She'd heard the whispers about the king's difficulties, his massive ulcerated leg, his enormous girth, the problems in the royal bedchamber that everyone knew about but nobody dared mention aloud. What if I fail? She whispered. Norfolk's expression went cold. You won't. Too much depends on it. And just like that, Catherine Howard's fate was sealed. Not by her choices, by theirs. Here's what you need to understand. Both women were installed as queens by powerful families seeking advantage. Anne Boleyn was no accidental seductress. The Boleyns, Thomas Boleyn and his ambitious family saw an opportunity when Henry's eye wandered from Catherine of Aragon. They cultivated Anne's wit, her French sophistication, her ability to keep a king interested without surrendering too quickly. 7 years of courtship wasn't Anne playing hard to get. It was strategic withholding, turning lust into obsession, into political revolution. Catherine Howard was even more straightforward. The Howards, having lost power when Anne fell, saw Henry's disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves as their chance to return. They pushed Catherine, young, pretty, biddable, into Henry's line of sight like a lure into water. She had no choice. You don't refuse your family, you certainly don't refuse the king. Both women were pawns before they were ever queens. Remember that. Anne, 1533 to 1535. Another girl. The midwife's words hung in the birthing chamber like accusation. Anne, exhausted and bloodied, reached for the infant anyway. Elizabeth. She would name her Elizabeth. The king will be disappointed, someone murmured. Anne's laugh was bitter. The king is always disappointed. 3 years of marriage, 1 living daughter, multiple miscarriages that left her weak and afraid. And Henry, her Henry, who had torn England apart to marry her, now looked at her with something approaching impatience. Outside the chamber, she knew what was happening. Courtiers exchanging meaningful glances. Whispers about the king's new interest. Jane Seymour. Meek, pale, conventional Jane, who made Henry feel like the masterful king he imagined himself to be, not the aging man he was becoming. "He's lost interest in me," she told her brother George weeks later when she could finally stand. George, loyal George, shook his head. "He's frustrated. Give him time. Give him a son." "And if I can't?" The silence between them answered everything. Anne Boleyn understood then what every woman understood eventually. In Tudor England, a queen's value was measured in living sons. She had broken a kingdom for Henry, but that would count for nothing if her womb failed him. Catherine, 1540 to 1541. "Again, Your Majesty, truly you spoil me." Catherine forced brightness into her voice as Henry presented her with another necklace, another gown, another gift she hadn't asked for. Around them, the court watched with knowing eyes. The king beamed. "Nothing is too good for my rose without a thorn." She managed not to flinch at the nickname. Rose without a thorn, as if she were perfect, uncomplicated, pure. If only he knew. That night, alone in her chambers except for her ladies, foolishly she'd appointed girls from her childhood, girls who knew her secrets. Catherine stared at her reflection. 16 years old, Queen of England, married to a man whose leg oozed pus through bandages, whose breath smelled of rot, whose body crushed hers in the marriage bed, while he huffed and strained and sometimes couldn't finish at all. "How's our young queen tonight?" whispered Francis Derham, appearing in the doorway. Catherine's blood went cold. "You shouldn't be here. If someone sees..." "If someone sees your private secretary attending to his duties..." He moved closer, and Catherine instinctively stepped back. "You appointed me yourself, remember? Such a generous queen, giving positions to old friends." "I never wanted..." "Wanted?" His smile was all teeth. "Catherine, sweet, foolish Catherine, you don't seem to understand how this works." He leaned against the doorframe, blocking her exit. "I know things. Things the king would find very interesting about his pure young bride. Things about the maiden's chamber at Lambeth, about what happened in the dark, about who touched whom." Catherine's hands trembled. "That was years ago. I was a child." "Were you?" He examined his nails with studied casualness. "I wonder how Henry would see it. Would he believe you were an innocent victim? Or would he think you were a whore who deceived him?" He paused, letting the words sink in like poison. His pride is so fragile these days. One whisper in the right ear and... He didn't need to finish. They both knew what happened to women who humiliated Henry VIII. "What do you want?" "Nothing. Yet." He smiled again, warmer now, more dangerous. "I'm simply reminding you that we're bound together, you and I. My fortune rises with yours, and if yours should fall," he shrugged, "well, let's make sure that doesn't happen. Keep me close, keep me comfortable, and your secrets stay buried." He left. Catherine stood trembling, understanding with terrible clarity that she hadn't appointed Francis Derham to her household. She'd been forced to, blackmailed into giving her tormentor a position of trust, where he could watch her, control her, ensure his leverage never slipped. She was trapped. Tell Henry the truth about her past? He'd annul the marriage in fury, humiliate her family, possibly worse. Keep silent? Francis would bleed her slowly, demanding favours, money, protection. And she was only 16 years old. And then there was Thomas Culpeper. Young, handsome Thomas, who looked at her like she was more than just a womb with a crown. Who made her laugh. Who reminded her she was still human, still young, still allowed to feel joy. The meeting started innocently, then became less innocent, then became, what? Treason? Love? A desperate grasp at something real in a world of calculation. Catherine didn't know anymore. She only knew she was drowning. Both women, you see, had committed the same crime. They'd failed to perform their function. Anne Boleyn's function was producing male heirs. By 1536, after 3 years of marriage, multiple miscarriages, and one living daughter, Henry had decided she was defective. Worse, she'd started arguing with him, questioning his decisions, acting like a partner rather than a possession. Anne had opinions about foreign policy. She clashed with Thomas Cromwell about what to do with money from dissolved monasteries. She wanted it for charity. Cromwell wanted it for the king. She had developed, in other words, political power. And that made her dangerous. Catherine's crime was different but equally fatal. She'd shattered Henry's illusions. The king, old and sick and impotent, needed to believe he was still virile, still masterful, still the golden prince he'd been at 20. Catherine was supposed to reflect that fantasy back at him. Instead, her past relationships suggested she found younger men more appealing. Her possible affair with Culpeper implied Henry couldn't satisfy her. She made the king look foolish, made him confront his own decline. For that, there could be no forgiveness. But here's what's crucial. Neither woman died because of what she'd actually done. They died because powerful men needed them gone. Anne, April 15th, 36. Thomas Cromwell sat in his office at Westminster, surrounded by papers, and contemplated murder. Not crude murder, legal murder, the kind where Parliament approved and the king could claim clean hands afterward. Anne Boleyn had to go. Not because she'd committed adultery, Cromwell knew better, but because she'd become a liability. The Queen had fallen out with him over monastery revenues. She wanted reform, charity, education. He wanted wealth flowing into royal coffers. They'd argued publicly. Anne had made him look weak. Worse, Henry was besotted with Jane Seymour now. He'd mentioned, casually, dangerously, how pleasant it would be to start fresh. How perhaps his marriage to Anne had been cursed from the beginning, like his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Cromwell was many things, but stupid wasn't one of them. He understood what Henry wanted, even when Henry couldn't articulate it himself. The king wanted Anne gone. He wanted to marry Jane. He wanted to believe this was all Anne's fault, her witchcraft, her adultery, her failure, not his own body's betrayal. Very well, Cromwell would give him that. He pulled out fresh parchment and began making notes. Who at court disliked Anne? Who had been humiliated when she rose to power? Who would testify against her if pressed? The musician Mark Smeaton, easily intimidated. Henry Norris, loyal to the king, could be trapped into incriminating statements. William Brereton, Francis Weston, courtiers who danced with the Queen, who could be framed. And George Boleyn, Anne's own brother, useful precisely because the charge would be so shocking that people might believe it out of sheer horror. Incest and adultery, treason, plotting to kill the king. None of it true, all of it plausible enough if you controlled the narrative. Cromwell smiled grimly. Within 2 weeks, Anne Boleyn would be dead, and everyone would remember the story he told, not the truth beneath it. Catherine, November 15th, 41. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer walked toward Hampton Court Chapel with a letter in his pocket that felt like lead. He was a Protestant reformer. The Howards were staunch Catholics. They'd manoeuvred young Catherine into the Queen's position specifically to restore Catholic power at court. And now, handed to him by John Lascelles, whose sister had lived in the same household where Catherine grew up, was evidence that the Queen had been sexually active before marriage. That she was, perhaps, engaging in an affair now. Cranmer should have felt triumph. This was his chance to destroy the Howard faction entirely, to rid the court of Catholic influence, to serve the reformist cause he dedicated his life to. Instead, he felt sick. Catherine Howard was a child, 17 at most, possibly younger. She'd been raised in neglect, possibly abused, definitely used by every adult who should have protected her. The evidence against her was testimony from women who'd shared her dormitory years ago, describing adolescent fumbling in the dark. But here's what Cranmer understood with cold clarity. It didn't matter if Catherine was guilty, it mattered that she was useful. The reformist faction needed the Howards gone. Henry was humiliated, the mighty king cuckolded by his teenage wife, and needed someone to blame. And Catherine, sweet and stupid and utterly unequipped to navigate Tudor politics, was the perfect sacrifice. Cranmer slipped the letter to Henry during Mass, watched the king's face darken with rage, then hurt, then righteous fury. "Investigate," Henry commanded. "Find the truth." But they both knew the truth didn't matter. Only the story did. And the story would end with Catherine's head in a basket. See it clearly now? Both executions were political assassinations, dressed up as moral justice. Anne Boleyn died because Thomas Cromwell needed her out of the way, and Henry needed to believe his marital failures weren't his fault. The charges, adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, were fabrications designed to shock, to make execution palatable, to let Henry play the wronged husband rather than the tyrant killing an inconvenient wife. Every man accused alongside Anne, innocent. Mark Smeaton confessed under torture. The others denied everything, but were convicted anyway by juries that included Anne's own relatives, men who knew the price of defying Henry VIII. Catherine Howard died because Protestant reformers saw a chance to destroy the Howard family's Catholic power base, and Henry couldn't bear being made to look impotent. The charges, premarital sexual activity and possible adultery, may have had some truth, but that wasn't why she was executed. She was executed because she was inconvenient, because she'd humiliated an aging king, because powerful men needed a scapegoat. Both women were murdered by the state. Both executions were legal, approved by Parliament, sanctioned by law. Both were fundamentally unjust. Anne, May 1536. I am the king's true wife. Anne spoke to the stones of her tower chamber, to the walls that offered no comfort. Outside, her brother George was already dead, beheaded that morning for imaginary crimes. I am the king's true wife, she repeated, as if saying it could make it real. But she wasn't, was she? Henry had already declared their marriage invalid. Not void from the beginning, that would make Elizabeth illegitimate. Just invalid, conveniently ended. How could Anne commit adultery against a marriage that supposedly never existed? The logic made her head hurt. Or maybe that was terror. Tomorrow, the French swordsman. Henry had ordered a sword rather than an axe. A mercy, they said. More skilled, quicker. Anne laughed, and it sounded like breaking glass. How thoughtful, how like him to orchestrate every detail. Because that's what this was, theatre. Henry hadn't attended her trial, wouldn't attend her execution. But he'd controlled everything, the charges, the jury, the verdict, even the weapon. He'd loved her once. Genuinely, she believed that. For 7 years he'd pursued her. For her, he'd broken with Rome, established the Church of England, defied the Pope and the Emperor. And now he'd kill her with the same decisive passion. I wonder, she murmured to her ladies, who watched her with terrified eyes, if he'll mourn me, after, when Jane Seymour is queen and I'm just a story he tells himself late at night. Your Majesty, don't. Anne held up a hand. Don't pretend this is justice, that I deserve this. We all know the truth. But tomorrow, on the scaffold, she would lie. She would praise Henry's mercy, say she deserved death for offending him, play her final role perfectly. Because even now she had one card left, Elizabeth, her daughter. If Anne died well, nobly, obediently, perhaps Henry would be merciful to their child. So she would lie, one last time, for love. Catherine, February 1542. They say I practised how to lay my head on the block. Catherine spoke to the darkness. She'd asked for the block to be brought to her chamber, had knelt before it, adjusted her position, made sure she understood the mechanics of her own death. "Mad," whispered one of her ladies. "Practical," Catherine corrected. "I won't die badly. I won't give them that." She was 17, maybe younger. And tomorrow she would die because men more powerful than her had decided she must. Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper were already dead, executed at Tyburn with unspeakable brutality. Derham because he'd blackmailed her, Culpeper because Henry couldn't bear to think his wife preferred a younger man, let alone his favourite groom. "They said we committed adultery," Catherine whispered to the darkness, "that we plotted to kill the king and marry each other." She thought of Thomas, sweet Thomas, who'd made her laugh during the royal progress, the late-night meetings Lady Rochford had arranged. No harm in conversation, Jane had promised. The gifts they'd exchanged, a cap, a chain, the letter she'd written. "I never longed so much for a thing as I do to see you and to speak with you." Had they kissed? Perhaps. Had they touched in ways that made her feel alive? She couldn't even remember now, through the fog of fear. Had they actually lain together, committed the adultery she was condemned for? Both she and Thomas had sworn under interrogation that they hadn't. He'd admitted he wanted to, foolish, honest Thomas, but that nothing had happened. She'd said the same. Whether anyone believed them didn't matter. In Tudor England, intent was treason. Secret meetings were treason. A letter expressing longing was treason. The appearance of adultery was enough. "I was 16, she said to no one. "I just wanted someone to talk to." Yet they'd died for it anyway. And tomorrow, so would she. "I was a child," Catherine said softly. When those things happened at Lambeth, I was 13, maybe 14. He was a grown man, my music teacher, my grandmother's secretary, men in positions of power over me. "Your Majesty, and nobody protected me, nobody taught me. My father was poor and absent. My grandmother left us unsupervised. The adults who should have safeguarded me instead used me. My family pushed me at Henry because I was pretty and young, and they wanted power back." She laughed bitterly. "I never had a choice. Not once. Not ever." Tomorrow she would go to the scaffold. Tomorrow she would say she deserved death for offending the king. Tomorrow she would lie, just like Anne had, because that's what was expected of queens who'd outlived their usefulness. The cruelest part? Both women went to their deaths cooperating with the men who killed them. Anne praised Henry's mercy even as she condemned his injustice by her very presence on the scaffold. She died nobly, quickly, earning reluctant admiration even from those who'd testified against her. Catherine practiced her death like a dance, determined not to struggle or cry out, not to give the crowd the spectacle of a hysterical girl. She died as composed as a 17-year-old could, under circumstances that should never have been asked of anyone. Both women protected the men who murdered them. Anne, by praising Henry, protected her daughter's future. Catherine, by confessing sins she may not have committed, protected her family from further persecution. They died with grace, with dignity, with courage that put their killers to shame. And Henry? Henry VIII married Jane Seymour before Anne's body was cold. 11 days, That's how long he mourned the woman he'd torn England apart to marry. After Catherine, the ageing, increasingly paranoid king took one more wife, Catherine Parr, wise enough to outlive him, but never with the passion he'd shown before. Maybe guilt finally caught up with him, or maybe he just ran out of women foolish enough to risk it. May 19th, 1536, Tower Green. Anne Boleyn knelt on the scaffold. The French swordsman stood behind her, blade concealed under straw so she wouldn't see it and panic. "I pray God save the king," Anne said clearly, "and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never." It was magnificent. It was utterly false. Everyone knew it. "She dies well," someone in the crowd murmured. The swordsman struck. One blow. Over. Anne Boleyn, aged somewhere between 29 and 35, nobody was quite sure, was dead. Her body was shoved into an arrow chest because nobody had bothered to prepare a proper coffin. She was buried under the floor of the Tower Chapel in an unmarked grave. Within weeks, Henry had her name chiselled off every surface at court, her badges replaced with Jane Seymour's, her portraits destroyed. Anne Boleyn was erased from history as thoroughly as Henry could manage. But he failed. Because here we are, nearly 500 years later, still talking about her, still knowing her name. While Henry VIII is remembered primarily for killing his wives, Anne Boleyn is remembered for surviving him in memory. February 13th, 1542, Tower Green. Catherine Howard trembled so badly they had to help her up the scaffold steps. But once she reached the block, she steadied. "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper," legend claims she said. She didn't. That's a romantic invention. What she actually said was much more conventional. She deserved death. Henry was merciful. Pray for her soul. But people wanted to believe she'd defied him at the end. Wanted to believe this 17-year-old girl had found courage to speak her truth. Maybe that's its own kind of justice. The axe fell. Unlike Anne's clean death, Catherine's required one stroke but wasn't instantaneous. She died quickly, but not instantly, not painlessly. She was buried in the same chapel as Anne, near the same unmarked spot. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, who'd facilitated Catherine's meetings with Culpeper, was executed immediately after. 3 Howard women now lay beneath Tower stones, murdered by the same man. Henry VIII never spoke Catherine's name again. He was 50 years old, increasingly paranoid, crippled by his leg ulcer, and descending into the tyranny that would define his final years. He would live 4 more years, long enough to marry once more, long enough to ensure his son Edward would inherit a troubled kingdom, long enough to understand, perhaps, what he'd done, but probably not. So here's the truth, stripped clean of legend and propaganda. Both women were victims of a system that valued them only for what they could produce: sons, political alliances, validation of male power. And when they failed to deliver, the system discarded them. The charges, witchcraft, adultery, incest, treason, were window dressing, legal fiction, stories told to make murder palatable. and for nearly 500 years, we've been arguing about whether his victims deserved their fate, when the real question was never about their guilt. It was about his. Anne and Catherine rest together now, beneath the stones of St. Peter ad Vincula, in unmarked graves that have become a pilgrimage site. Hundreds of years later, we remember their names, their stories, their humanity. While Henry VIII, despite the significant impact of his reign and obsession with having male heirs, is still primarily remembered for the women in his life. Perhaps that's its own kind of justice. Their deaths were not their fault, but their courage, walking to the scaffold with dignity, protecting the people they loved even as they were murdered in cold blood, that was real. That was entirely their own. Rest well, Anne. Rest well, Catherine. And to you, dear listener, sleep well. Until next time.